Graham, David, the release of Tibet, a Buddhist trilogy on DVD is a very significant moment, but perhaps not quite as significant as the film's emergence in the mid-70s, when the vision it revealed must have been extraordinary to cinema goers. The revelation of this almost completely unknown world, I would imagine. Looking back on it now after a period of nearly 30 years, Graham, how do you think about the inspiration that brought you to make such a work?
Well, the themes of the film, I hope, are sort of atemporal. I think in the beginning, the sort of seed, if you like, that inspired the making of the film was because I was brought up in Luxor, which is the capital of ancient Egypt. My father was an Egyptologist. So as a child, I was surrounded by a culture where the temples were at the heart of the society. The media were essentially sacred. And it was difficult not to be aware, even as a child, that the society that was depicted in the temples and tombs was extraordinarily elegant and peaceful. Mm-hmm. And there was a sense of sort of interdependence between human beings and the environment and the elements. And those original inspirations or thoughts or acknowledgements, appreciations, they later became part of the inspiration for making the film.
What took you from Egypt to Tibet to an Eastern culture? How did that journey happen for you?
Well, I began training as a theatre director, and I was somewhat disillusioned by the thought of having to continuously, that the media is so absorbed with the sort of dissonance of human emotion. Mm-hmm. And it struck me from reading and from thinking about theatre and thinking about other people who had written about theatre and the media and the arts, that the role of the media could be different in another culture. We're all confronted by suffering, we're all confronted by loss, we're all confronted by impermanence, we're all confronted by change. But mainstream media no longer addresses those issues. Mm-hmm. So when I was, shortly after leaving university, I began reading more about Tibetan culture, mm-hmm. mainly, again, because of this connection with Egypt. I was interested in the sort of pharaonic, the god-king type relationship, the idea of a society being based around a very strong spiritual core. So I went to India, spent time there, and I was profoundly impressed by the fact that the media, the rituals, the performing arts in Tibetan culture were all to do with trying to give people a more transforming perspective on their life, ways in which they could deal with adversity, ways in which basic human suffering could be addressed or transformed. So that was really the main inspiration for making the central part of the film, the Tara ritual.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the move yourself from working in theatre to obviously making a film, how did that come about? Did film feel like the natural, almost the inevitable medium in which you would like to engage with these issues and rituals?
Yes, I mean, one of the frustrations of the theatre is that if, for instance, a yogi or a practitioner has spent, say, 15, 20 years in retreat trying to understand the nature of mind, trying to understand the nature of the human condition, that's not something you can act. But the wonderful thing about film is that if you put somebody in front of the camera who has those qualities of experience, you can feel these things. And that's almost miraculous, because it's just a piece of celluloid. Mm-hmm. But somehow or another, that kind of subtlety of their way of experiencing does come through. Mm-hmm. So making a film seemed like definitely the right way to communicate these things.
Mm-hmm. Well, we should definitely come back to perhaps the quality of film itself to catch this timeless and spiritual quality. But David, let's come to you and how you came on board, and what particular challenges you found in the actual making, the realisation of this extraordinary project.
Well, Graham and I knew each other at university in Bristol, where I studied drama. I'd always been interested in film. Again, loved the movies, loved everything to do with the movies. At that time was very attracted particularly by the sort of great documentary filmmakers of that time. That was a thing we shared. Pennebaker, the Maysles brothers, particularly Fred Wiseman's movies about American institutions, and just that way of being sort of burying yourself in an environment and observing what's going on and making extraordinarily rich and actually dramatic films out of that raw material. And that's something we talked about, you know, because was there a way of finding a sort of similar language or a similar approach to filming in a different culture. So we travelled out in late 1975. We were lucky enough, Graham had been very busy in making connections in the Tibetans resident in this country, starting to teach or make connections, relatively few at that time. And the person who helped us enormously in the initial stages was a young Tibetan called Sogyal Rinpoche, since become very well known here, writer of the best-selling books, and teacher here and in France now and in America and so on. And he travelled with us to India in late 1975, and through him, really, we were able to meet then all the great teachers, the heads of the different lineages, and have very easy, I mean now in retrospect we realise how incredibly lucky and how easy that was to have access to all the sort of leading practitioners of that time, which kind of laid the groundwork for making the film a year later.
David, it's very significant, I think, that you mentioned obviously Fred Wiseman, someone who films institutions, films within closed communities, give us an extraordinary sense of how these dynamic organisations work for the individuals and the larger collective. Clearly that's a great lesson that you've applied to the extraordinary community that we see in this film. But tell us something a little bit about the formal process of access and how it actually worked for you making the film, because clearly this idea, this need for a certain kind of invisibility within such personal and private spaces as this kind of ritual must have been very important, obviously, and perhaps quite a challenge.
Because we were a tiny crew, 4 people, we were able to spend a lot of time in different places, not like a broadcast crew growing in there and only be able to afford so many days and no overtime, you know, all those restrictions of working within that kind of environment. We didn't have any of those. So we were able to spend, in effect, as long as it took, or as long as the money held out, in all of those places to do what we needed to do, which meant we could spend quite a lot of time in the places before we even turned the cameras on. So they got used to having us around. We never, or only on 1 or 2 occasions, did we ask anybody to do anything, as it were, especially for the cameras, and then it would only have been stuff they would have done anyway.
Thank you. I mean, let's come back to how the film developed sort of in its assembly and how it travelled. But Graham, let's talk about this crucial element of the 3-part structure. David mentioned obviously the essential role the Dalai Lama played in granting access, and in some ways the tripartite approach takes us as the general viewer, if you like, from the most familiar incarnation of Tibetan culture, the Dalai Lama himself, through then into this extremely private ritual, but then even further into the, if you like, onto the threshold of the very book of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and death itself and beyond. I mean, this journey further and further into the heart of the culture. Was that always a kind of given for you in terms of how you conceived the film?
Absolutely. I mean, that we wanted to try and give us some kind of social orientation to the relationship between the monasteries and the people, and also, of course, the Dalai Lama and the people. That was really just contextual. And also we wanted to show also that the meditative and contemplative and arts aspect of the culture were grounded in years of study through logical debate. So including the debates in the beginning of the film was very important, so that people could understand this was not a society in which purely contemplation was important, but before you even began long periods of retreat, you spent 15 or more years honing your philosophical understanding of the nature of the human condition. So that was very important to set the context. And then, as you say, not just in terms of the subject matter, but in making the film, we were very much trying to go from starting off in a more normal kind of a documentary style, even with a commentator, but then slowly, trying to take the audience into the experience of being of looking at things from a Tibetan point of view, because the kind of stillness and the dignity and even the warmth and the lightheartedness comes out of, at that time, this was in the 1970s, before the impact of media, comes out of that kind of stillness, comes out of a real appreciation of moment by moment experience. Most of the time we're very distracted. We're thinking of the past, we're thinking of the future, and actually the real creativity and the real vibrancy and the real dignity and peace is right there in each moment. So we wanted to slowly strip away the things that most people, when watching a film, would hold on to, sort of conflict, fast editing, strong narrative themes, and try to get the audience to draw into this more meditative, if you like, experience of just watching things unfold in their own pace.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, the point that you made, Graham, about pacing is something perhaps that when the film appeared in the late 70s would have been an issue perhaps then for viewers, for audiences across England and the United States perhaps particularly. Mm-hmm. But perhaps it's even more of an issue now, given the acceleration of culture in which we find ourselves. And yet, at the same time, in parallel to that, there's been a greater familiarity, at least on the surface level, with Tibetan culture and the importance of the preservation of both culture and community. For many more people, perhaps, than was the case in the 70s. There's a strange sort of tension there.
Well, I've been a little bit surprised, to be honest, that we've had as many complaints almost about the pace of the film now that it's been re-released as we had when it was 4 hours long. I mean, I can remember, and I'm sure David does too, going to watch films like Phantom India that ran for 8 hours, and nobody ever really had a problem. But I think there is a sadness about it, is people's ability to just watch and be with certain kinds of images and certain kinds of relationships is harder. Mm-hmm. So that's I suppose a little bit of a disappointment. But on the other hand, I think perhaps the understanding of the value of what the film was trying to speak to is maybe more evident to people now in some ways than it was then. I think there's a very real concern almost amongst some people that the media has become so entirely entertainment based and so entirely to do with distraction and so entirely to do with trying to excite people emotionally, that it's no longer serving a function of giving people a more creative view of their own life or their own condition. So I think that's now more clear. And the thinking about continuity of consciousness, or thinking about the idea of life and death as two sides of a continuity, is becoming more openly acceptable than perhaps it was before. I mean, when we were young, I think talking about death at all in our culture was quite uncomfortable. And now there's a much more open appreciation, and people, I think, perhaps more aware, whether they believe in continuity of consciousness or not, they still think that perhaps there is some sense of life being related to a preparation for death, and you have some sense of not wanting to die scared, but of wanting to die and perhaps realizing that the moment of death offers some kind of an opportunity, or even the processes of death are somehow related to a higher understanding that we might reach in our own lifetime. So I think in those ways there's been quite a substantial development.
Well, I think going back to something that you said earlier, it's hard to think of a subject matter more suited to exploration in film perhaps than this, with film's unique quality perhaps of presenting a ceaseless present, if you like, every time the film is viewed. And I think we're all very grateful that you've released the film now on DVD again, an enduring form that we can come back to again and again. So thank you both very much for talking to me.
Thank you, Gareth.
Thanks, Gareth.